Okay. Everybody is here to hear One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported. Publishers Weekly has previewed this as the definitive work on the threat to our democracy posed by the Trump presidency. By three of Washington's premier political scholar journalists. So I want to read. I want to read. So that's what you're looking at right up here. And then they are going to talk with Deborah Tannen afterwards. Deborah is a. All right, first of all, E.J. Dionne is a columnist for the Washington Post, a senior fellow at Brookings, a professor at Georgetown, a visiting professor at Harvard. Norman Ornstein is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a contributing editor and columnist for the National Journal and the Atlantic. And together with Thomas Mann, he is a co-author of the New York Times bestseller, It Looks Even Worse. It's even worse than it looks. Sorry. Yeah, I got it finally. And Thomas Mann is a resident scholar at the Institute for Governmental Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Yeah. And to join them, to incite them all in conversation, we have Deborah Tannen, Deborah Tannen has been coming to our store for a long time, for at least since 30 years, Deborah? Is it that long? More actually. Since 1985. She came here first for You Just Don't Understand. After that's not what I meant. But I want to urge you all to buy Deborah's most relevant book to this evening. It's called The Argument Culture. It's very, very, as I said, relevant to the media and Donald Trump right now. So I'm going to hand it over to Deborah and let her get started on, as I said, inciting these three guys to conversation. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you. Wow. And I'm going to stand to ask my questions so that I'm not blocking the people here to my right. The first thing I want to say is thank you. And I think everyone here wants to say that. Thank you so much for giving us the book that we all need right now. You are, in this book, brilliantly, eloquently, clearly answering the questions that I think we all have and we've all been struggling with since November. And I think they fall under three categories. First of all, how did this happen? Second, how bad is it really? Are we overreacting in feeling that we will never recover and that this is worse than anything we've seen in our lifetimes? You're going to answer that. And third, maybe most important, the whole second half of your book, what can we do? Is there hope? You do say there is hope, for which we're very grateful. And then you tell us what that hope is and what we can do. Just to set the stage, I'm going to ask EJ to read just the first page of the introduction, which to set the stage for us here as it does for the book.
I just want to say before I do that, thank you to the bookstore that has, from the moment it opened its doors, been one of the greatest bookstores in America. I want to thank some dear old friends who are here and new friends who are here. I want to thank Deborah for doing this today. At the end, Deborah will offer a careful analysis of what we said, and she'll tell you what we really meant. So I look forward to that. And lastly, I want to report that this book involves a miracle, which is 3 friends on 2 coasts having to work together on this subject and being better friends at the end than we were at the beginning. So I want to thank Tom and Norm, and we thank each other. Our last acknowledgement is the most unusual in a book. We actually thank each other because that can be a miracle. So bless you all. So as Deborah said, the first line of the book is American democracy was never supposed to give the nation a president like Donald Trump. We have had more or less ideological presidents and more or less competent presidents. We have had presidents who divided the country and presidents whose opponents saw them as a danger to everything they believed in. But we have never had a president who aroused such grave and widespread doubts about his commitment to the institutions of self-government, to the norms democracy requires, to the legitimacy of opposition in a free republic, yes, take that knee, and to the needs for basic knowledge about major policy questions and about how government works. We have never had a president who daily raises profound questions about his basic confidence and his psychological capacity to take on the most powerful and challenging political office in the world. We have never had a president who spoke more warmly of dictators than of democratic allies, and whose victory came with the assistance of a foreign power that meddled in our election. We have, in short, never had a president who, from his first day in office, plainly showed that he had no business being president.
And I have to say, I read this book very carefully. When I came to that line, he had no business being president, I knew that I was in good hands. Because you tell us all these things we need to know, but with just the right tone. By the way, you taught me a word, and I'm very grateful. I love the word, but I hate what it represents. Kakistocracy. Have you heard of the word kakistocracy? You guys define it as government by the least competent. But I think it's actually worse than that. It's from the Greek kakos, which means bad. So kakistocracy, I think, arguably is government by the worst possible people. You want to comment already?
Just if you know the word caca, that's also.
And Norm insisted that that word be in the book.
I'm not kidding when I love that you taught me this new word. And I hate that we need it.
Deborah speaks Greek fluently, you should know.
Maybe that's why I loved it. Let's start with that first question, how we got here. You make, and you have a lot of evidence, but maybe you can just tell us some of it, that Trump did not come out of nowhere. The word you use is, it has been, was long in gestation. So could you tell us a bit about what led up to it? And I'm again going to start with one kind of wordplay here. You have a whole chapter about how Trump is normless, and we know that the terrible thing is there are no norms, but the really worst thing is he didn't have Norm as his advisor. But that is part of it. This normlessness did not start with Trump. So
I think we would call your attention after we have originally, can you hear me all? Okay. To the context in which Donald Trump was actually able to enter the competition for the Republican nomination and in the end to win. It really, and I hate to cite our own work, but it's even worse.
That's what we're here for.
It's even worse than it looks, and why the right went wrong. Both make the same point about the radicalization of the Republican Party, the asymmetry that's developed in our politics, the way in which one of our major parties has really lost any incentive and any interest in serious governing. in looking for remedies to real problems. It's become an ideological war. It's become an effort to promote a set of interests, and it's been developing for decades. And we trace that out. Had Donald Trump run as an independent, he would have lost. Hillary would have been president. Had he sought the Democratic nomination, it would have been a joke. He wouldn't have been competitive at all. We watched him seek the Republican nomination and laughed and thought, this is ridiculous. But the reality was, sadly, the Republican Party and its leaders, its officials, have been telling people in their own way what Donald Trump said during the course of the campaign, demonizing of the opposition, they weren't legitimate to be the party that governs our country. And that's the conspiracy theories and the like, so that Donald Trump began his most recent foray into politics with the birtherism campaign, and almost no Republican officials contested that. Even the Speaker of the House then, John Boehner, said, well, people can believe what they want, which it seems to me that means there's something more than Trump. There is Trumpism, and it includes the Republican Party. And if we are going to use this really scary development constructively, we have to use it to really reinvigorate our democracy, and that means turning the Republican Party into a governing party once again, and getting to the point where speaking truth and using evidence and appreciating science and understanding that compromise is an important part of politics. All of these things have to come back.
I just want to say a couple quick things. First, notice Tom is so humble that he doesn't plug his own book. It's like that old line, a liberal is somebody so open-minded that she or he can't take their own side in an argument. So God bless you, Tom. We're not guilty of that in this book. Two quick things. One of the things we stress in the book is that America is becoming a non-majoritarian democracy, which is a very strange thing for a democracy to be. It is not just the Electoral College, though that's important. And we note that there's an acceleration of the Electoral College being out of line with the popular vote. We argue that's because the metropolitanization of the country means that the Electoral College is increasingly out of touch with the popular vote. Second, the Senate, on which the Electoral College is partly based, is more and more out of line with the population. Start of the Republic ratio between largest and smallest states, 13-1. Now it's 70-1. Thirdly, you've got gerrymandering, which is distorting the popular vote in House races. Then you got the power of political money. The second thing I just want to say is we talk a lot about, and I won't go through it all, I hope you read it in the book, the whole debate about whether Trump got elected because of race, culture, immigration on the one side, or economics on the other. It's pretty clear from the survey data that as Tom said, he got elected first and foremost because Republicans voted for the Republican candidate. Second, that race and culture were indeed extremely important to the Trump constituency. The studies based on survey data point to race, culture, immigration, but the studies based on geography point out that Trump's strongest places were places where economic anxiety tended to be highest, high rates of foreclosure. So we argue against what we see as two forms of denial. You cannot deny the role of race and immigration and those issues in Trump's rise, and we've had another example of that in the last 36 hours, but you cannot deny the economic context, and we have to do something about that.
So let me, I want to first add my thanks to Deborah, who took a lot of time from writing her next book on her father, which will be a must-read, and promoting her most recent book, which is a must-read, to do this.
Thank you.
But I also
It was an honor.
as
Norm
we,
is trying to associate us with that must-read
that's
word.
right.
It's very subtle.
if we go back to the question, the roots of all of this, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One is it predated even the 1970s. It was the collapse of community, the atomization in the country, the sense that so many people have that they weren't connected to others around them, much less to the country as a whole. And you can take it back to Putnam and Bowling Alone, as we do, to Kai Erikson writing about a community's collapse after a flood, to Bill Bishop on our moving into areas where we're surrounded by like-minded people. But then as we also move forward to the collapse of norms and the radicalization of the Republican Party, there are two names especially to keep in mind. Newt Gingrich, who has been our hobby horse for a very long time, going back to the 70s, who almost single-handedly encouraged, if not created, the tribalism that has replaced simple partisanship and polarization that goes beyond polarization, and Mitch McConnell, who blew up the Senate and continues to do so to this very day, creating the craziness in Congress. And it's not just Trump. It is a Republican Congress out to destroy health care and the entire legislative process for no good reason other than a victory and to erase whatever Barack Obama did.
Well, you guys can see you don't need me here. That now is just about half the time we have, and I have at least 60 more questions.
We studied the filibuster closely.
Let me move at least to one really important issue here, and that's the press. Most recently, when I've been at several forums, kind of like this one, not as big a crowd, where members of the press were speaking, and in every case there was a general kind of celebration, congratulations, cheering them on because they are standing up to Trump, and I think that's very well deserved, and it's really important that we're doing that. But looking back to how we got there, you quote from a Harvard study, this is the quote, "The car wreck that was the 2016 election had many drivers. Journalists were not alone in the car, but their fingerprints were all over the wheel." So I'd like you to just say a little bit about the role of the press getting us to Trump's taking office. And so many of the people that I talk to are asking themselves, why didn't I do more? What could I have done differently? Do you hear anything among journalists? Is there any soul searching there? And is there anything that would give us any hope that it might be different in the future?
Speaking as somebody who's been in journalism a long time, so if I can start. First of all, by the way, I want to shout out our agent, Gail Ross, who's here, who represented about 20% of the nonfiction books in this bookstore. It's good to see you, Gail. I think there are very clear signs of that. One of the most powerful was Margaret Sullivan, who writes about the press in the Washington Post and who had been the public editor of the New York Times. And she wrote a very strong piece recently about the dangers of false equivalence, which we've been arguing about for a long time. And in this campaign, you saw a fair amount of that Hillary Clinton had the normal flaws a normal politician has. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were not the same thing. These flaws that Donald Trump had were, as we've seen, something quite different. And yet there was an effort to kind of mush this together at times. There were all kinds of stories about, well, if we report this about Trump, we ought to report that about Clinton. And I'm all for fairness. I've been in this business for a long time, but fairness cannot be the enemy of truth or fact. And sometimes there aren't two sides to a factual question. Now, most reporters know that, but I think only, since this election, there has been this soul searching. You have seen, Lord knows we need to defend a free press right now because it is one of the strongest forces holding the president to account. And if I may say it, in the book we have a chapter on his authoritarian or autocratic tendencies where, what the autocrat does is attack the press, attack the judiciary, and demonize his opponents. So we're seeing an awful lot of that now. So I think there have been lessons learned here in the media. And I know that my friends in reporting work really, really hard at their jobs, but Trump presented them with something different. One other thing quick. Television was different than print. And we were in our kitchen in late 2015, and the TV had a live Trump speech on. And I didn't want to watch a live Trump speech, so I turned the channel. And it was the same live Trump speech. And I turned to my wife, Mary, bless you for being here, Mary. And I said, what has this become, Trump state television? And I think that there's an awareness, there's a lot to answer for.
I saw something worse, which was 30 minutes on cable networks showing an empty podium waiting for Trump while Hillary was giving a substantive speech. But I need to add a couple of things here. It wasn't all television. And James Fallows, in a very good piece just recently, juxtaposed two New York Times headlines. One, more questions raised about Hillary's emails, which was one of probably 100 front page headlines from the New York Times. And the other was, FBI shows no evidence of Russian collusion. This was a week before the election. And if you looked at word clouds, what people thought about the election, with Hillary it was overwhelmingly emails, and with Trump it was immigration and other issues. And television was much worse, there's no doubt, but the biggest and most disturbing thing that I see is I see a press that's now stepping up to the plate, but zero introspection. No one's going back and saying, how could we have done what we did, and what did we do wrong? And all of these stories that had anonymous sources that lied to reporters, including that one in the New York Times from the FBI. They have an obligation, I believe, to out sources who lie to them. And we hear nothing about that. People get away with it. So Margaret Sullivan is fantastic. When she left the Times, I think it made a huge difference, unfortunately, with the Times. But we need more Margaret Sullivans and more reporters and editors who start to think about what they've done.
But could I say, I do think actually there is some real introspection going on, Norm, and I think Margaret Sullivan's piece reflects that. And this following comment has nothing to do with anything Norm said, but I got to say I'm very proud I work for the Washington Post.
Yes.
But Hillary Clinton ended up being the lowest rated presidential candidate, except for Donald Trump, in the history of polling. Now, you have to ask yourself, how did that happen? Yes, she has flaws. We all have flaws. But Obama said, remember, she's the most qualified person to be president of the United States.
Hold the mic up.
So it's important to keep in mind what has happened here. Somehow, during the course of this campaign, when we had our first dalliance with an authoritarian sort of style of leadership and complete ignorance about the policy issues that we have to confront, there was an equivalence made during the course of the campaign between Mr. Trump and Hillary Clinton. And I blame the New York Times a lot. They and the Post are great newspapers, but they made that error almost up until the end of the campaign, so that Trump managed to win by 77,000 votes in 3 states in spite of losing the popular vote, because enough people sort of not paying a whole lot of attention, but just hearing and seeing email, corruption, crooked, that was enough to turn this election.
There is also the Comey matter, but we won't go there.
And I'll just add a point that you make in the book, that because Trump had so many horrible things, did one horrible thing after another, it was a different story every day. Whereas what they had against Hillary was mostly one thing, emails. But that meant you heard about emails every day for 3 months. And by this bizarre phenomenon of repetition, it got blown up out of proportion, and all the others got.
We write in the book, Trump is the only politician in history who fended off one scandal with a new scandal.
But it worked that way.
And it worked pretty well.
Yeah. No, I think it's a significant insight. It's a really important point, that sometimes something about the way information comes across is more powerful than the content of the information.
And the scandals continue one a day, and we are now deadened to, for example, the outrageous kleptocracy that extends down to Steve Mnuchin, Secretary Price, and a whole host of others.
In other words, the same thing is happening now.
Yeah, we're deadened
One
to the
thing after
scandals.
another, so not one of them seems all that important.
We flew commercial to get here.
Maybe I'll ask just 2 more questions, and then we'll open it up for your questions. So I do want to move toward the second half of your book, which is about leaving us with some kind of hope and leaving us with some very specific ideas about what could be done. So you do give a roadmap forward. You talk about, and I say answer in a few minutes. That's not going to be possible, probably. A new economy, a new patriotism, a new civil society, and a new democracy. So can you talk about those?
Can I do the new economy real quick, and then I want to go with my colleagues to come in a little bit on patriotism. There is no question that the country has gone through a very long period where there has been a rise in economic inequality, and that this is a problem in many, many ways, and it really showed itself in this campaign. It shouldn't have taken Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, for that matter, to show the country that we had this problem. And this inequality is insidious because it has really taken some parts of the country and had them sort of move away economically from the metropolitan centers. Now, one of the things we are very careful about in this book is not to say that progressives need to pay attention to the white working class. We argue that progressives need to pay attention to the working class, white, Latino, and African American. And I think that it is and we have a lot of proposals that I won't go into, but you'll see them in the book, relating to guaranteed jobs, job training, some redistribution measures, ways of making corporations more responsible. Corporations did not used to be judged solely by shareholder value, and that was, we need an older vision of the corporation as serving a larger interest. We have a lot of specific proposals, but what we underscore is you cannot have a politics where one group's pain is held against another group's pain. And that's kind of politics that, unfortunately, the president engages in. The problems of deindustrialization, which have hit places like Reading and Erie and places all over the Midwest, and even my hometown at Fall River, Massachusetts, are all problems that, as the great sociologist William J. Wilson showed, were showing up in the inner city 30 years ago. So we need a multiracial conversation. And I like to remind everybody that at that great 1963 Civil Rights March, the slogan was jobs and freedom. Economic justice was married to racial justice and civil rights, and we need to do that again.
So just a word or two on civil society. We talked about the atomization. We believe that Donald Trump has provided a jolt. And I sometimes say that Trump is our Dunkirk, where civil society rose up when they saw the threat. We're now seeing an enormous uprising of all different kinds of groups out there. And it's religious groups, it is the press, it is all kinds of others. It's independent bookstores doing things like this. And we should thank Brad and Lissa for continuing the tradition that Carla started, and that this is a haven for that. Yes. And Barbara. A word on patriotism. We have a lot that discusses patriotism versus nationalism. What Trump is doing is nationalism of the worst and ugliest sort. It's not all ugly. Many of our presidents have been nationalists. This is not patriotism when you argue against people who express themselves and try to improve the society. And finally, on democracy, EJ touched on some of these things, but we have a whole set of areas where we can move to improve the structures of our system and to engage voters more. And a part of it is marrying civil society, and many of those groups, like the Campaign Legal Center and CREW, for example, who are stepping up to the plate, not only to deal with kleptocracy, but to try to protect against the evil and ugly voter suppression that is going on and is being magnified, and to change the system to move it back towards one where the people matter.
So what is the way forward? I see it in three parts. One is to contain the damage that is done while Donald Trump is in office. And there we can take some satisfaction in the efforts of lawyers around the country at the right time, and people of faith and groups of citizens who've been active immediately to try to reduce the damage and to fight every day not to normalize the behavior he's engaging in. The second is to hasten the time at which he leaves. I don't know when that's going to be. I mean, the worst of worlds is 2 full terms in office. I think that's very, very unlikely. It could be a
Melania will shoot him before that. Don't worry.
It could be a resignation. It could be impeachment. Things could get frustrating if Democrats regain control of the House in the midterm elections. That will make such a big difference. And of course, the Mueller investigations are absolutely critical to, and we don't know what's there exactly, what it's going to produce, but that's the second thing. We're praying and hoping and acting to hasten the date of his departure. But the third is preparing the way for our democracy to restore itself in the wake of this experience. And that's what so much of the second part of this book is about. It really is beginning to talk to one another, to believe in the efficacy of political activism that's smart. We're not naive about politics. We know there's strong identities, group identities, party identities, and it's a mess. And we know that most Americans aren't like you, showing up here at Politics and Prose. But boy, is there room for citizen activism and the kind of groups that have sprouted up like Indivisible and Swing Left, and the groups that are changing themselves, including the ACLU and Planned Parenthood and others that are really beginning to work as a coalition across issues instead of just single issue efforts. It makes a huge difference. So we're not naive. We believe politics ain't beanbag. It's tough and hard. Money in politics matters a lot. I mean, how offended are you that the Mercers are in the position they're in right now? It just sickens me to realize that they buy themselves a Breitbart and a Bannon, and they get the attention of key groups working in the activist base and the social media of the right. I mean, that's not a democracy. And we've got to set the stage so that when he is gone, we'll have a much better democracy than before he came on the scene.
And could I add something real quick? Because we talk, there's a lot of anger in the country right now. You're hearing some of it up here. But if there's another kind of slogan in this book, it's Make America Empathetic Again. And one of the things we're suffering from as a country is we're having a lot of trouble understanding the pain of people who aren't like us, whoever the us is. And even though I disagree with what somebody who voted for Donald Trump who lives in a factory town or a town in Appalachia that's really suffered, boy, we ought to be able to understand why that person is mad. And if that person expresses his or her anger in a way that's racist, we condemn the racism, but we got to understand their suffering. At the same time, we ask them to understand the suffering of an African American in the inner city who does not think it's right that his teenage son might be shot even though he's unarmed. And we've got to be able to understand each other again, and we desperately need leadership in the country that's trying to get us to understand each other rather than dividing us against each other.
I'm not going to ask any more questions, because there's people already. We have people lined up for the question period. But I did start with a quote from the beginning of the book, so I just want to wrap up with a quote from your book. Toward the end, these brilliant writers say, "The fight against Trump is ultimately a fight to reclaim the dignity of public life and the honor of democratic politics." And the title of the last chapter is Show Up, Dive In, Stay at It. And so you are ending with telling us what to do. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. You certainly are a great follow-up to when Katie Tour was here on Friday, and so many of the same people were here. Thank you. Would you comment on the activity and role of the Kushners and your anticipation of their early return to New York?
My wife Judy, who is here with me, and I live 2 blocks from them. I'm careful not to go out on Saturday mornings so I don't accidentally bump into them.
Norm has made potluck supper
right.
for his
No. The Kushners in many ways represent the kleptocracy here, which is so reminiscent of what we see in Erdogan's Turkey, in Putin's Russia, in Sisi's Egypt, the whole family enriching themselves off of their government positions. And at the same time, we know and we've seen the Kushner family, including those who are not Jared, trying to leverage that in China to make more money. And we also know that Jared met with Russian banks after the election, and which he couldn't recall exactly, but was about very likely loans for this building at the appropriately numbered 666 Fifth Avenue. And we know that Ivanka in her business practices is very much like her father. And the idea that she has a moderating impact has never been accurate. But this is a broader problem with the Trump and Trump family. And, I think we can say a lot of people thought this was a folk message for many decades. If only government could be run like a business. And it is. The business is Trump University.
Do they understand? Do you have any
Maybe
clue
we have so many people lined up.
how they lack knowledge on these subject matters
No.
that they've been tasked? Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe we'll go. Yeah.
Some comments on 2 levels. The first is more conscious, picking up from something you were just talking about in terms of the people who are less informed. Trump promised economic prosperity as though they would all be rich, and also protection against the invading hordes for people who have paranoid tendencies with the wall and the immigration. But on a deeper level, and this applies not just to Trump, it applies to Hitler and many, many other leaders. Freud, nearly 100 years ago, wrote a not too well-known paper called On Group Psychology, not just what was going on intrapsychically. When you identify with a leader because he's going to protect you or help you, at the same part and parcel of the identification is you dissolve your conscience into, in this case, the vacuous conscience of the leader. So you can allow your misogyny, your racism, and your denigration of others to be voiced by others that you couldn't socially acceptably say.
We'll take
want-
that.
I
I get
Yeah.
the question. Thank you very, very much, sir. Let me just say, I am very uneasy. I'm a Democrat, small d, all the way down, which means I never like the idea much of talking about less informed voters. Believe me, I've walked into the polls on some local races and felt distinctively less informed myself, and I'm supposed to be somebody who knows about these things, that it's a mistake, I think, to see the people who vote the other way as automatically less informed. I do think that there is where I'll pick up on your point is that I think Trump exploited a lot of different forms of resentment in the electorate, and he exploited the very disconnection that we talked about. Yoni Applebaum wrote a great piece in The Atlantic called "Voting Alone," which is a play on bowling alone, where a lot of the Trump constituency seemed to be more disengaged from various forms of activism than other parts of the Republican Party. And so I think your fears about a movement that might lead in a dangerous direction, I think there's something to that. But, the job of those of us who want to turn politics around, I think, is to take a look at what part of the discontent that led to Trump can we, I'll say this as somebody who's a progressive or a liberal, can we address in a way that brings us together, that also addresses the anxieties of groups that voted against Trump? And, a unifying politics of that sort, people call this my Bobby Kennedy fantasy. But I think when you look at successful moments in our politics, leaders like FDR or Bobby Kennedy managed to address discontents across a broad field and could understand the anxieties even of people who disagreed with them. But thank you so much for your question.
We're all the victims of your brilliance. We have lots and lots of
our
people waiting.
long-windedness, our apologies.
We have lots and lots of people waiting to ask questions and 20 minutes left because we want to leave time for
So it'll all be
book
yes
signing.
or no
So,
questions.
Yeah.
No.
Say everything you want to say, but as succinctly as possible on
Yeah.
both sides.
I just have a quick question. Norm, you have the prospects of governmental action or regulatory action nil at this point. What is the role of going outside the political system to be able to deal with the type of threats and challenges that we face today that you deal with in the book, especially in civil society?
First, I don't discount the threat of regulatory action, even though you have a Congress that seems incapable of passing much of anything, and thank goodness, given the things that they're considering. The executive actions taken by Trump and the unwillingness to implement laws is real and a danger. And we have a cabinet that includes many people who are radical and don't respect the law. Now, to your question, and this is Bruce Freed, who has actually become very much engaged in trying to change corporate governance. One of the areas that we discuss in the book, going through the courts, working to whatever extent is possible through regulatory agencies, unfortunately most of which are being undermined, but using citizen action and putting pressure on politicians, as Indivisible does and some of the other groups we're talking about, even if they avoid their own constituents and avoid town meetings, is something that has to be done and has to be continued. And we applaud groups that are seeing that sometimes you can't just look inside the political process, that our pressure can come and democracy from outside.
In this case, because we have a unified Republican government, we have a Republican Party that's still holding on to the fact that Trump may sign some bills that we've wanted for a long time. It means we can be active to stop them from doing some damaging things. But much of the initiative has, as Bruce said, move outside. Outside the system, corporate leaders, lawyers, people of faith.
One sentence with a semicolon in it. You can't achieve change without political action, but you can't change politics without action from the outside of politics. It's a dialectical matter, and we need both. Right. That was two sentences. I apologize.
So I'm a New Deal Democrat from Massachusetts, just like you. What do we do about the 30% of the population that believes everything Trump says, every conspiracy theory? They've been going like that since the Southern strategy started in the 70s and under Reagan in the 80s. I can give money, I can make phone calls, I believe in swinging left or whatever it's called, but no red state person is going to listen to someone like me. I am the elite and they hate us.
Just you answered your own question in a way. We've always had 30% of the, 20 to 30% of the country has always been on the fairly far right. And I think one of the troubling things about now is you kind of mainstream some of that old-fashioned, I'll call it right-wing extremism. That leaves 70% of the country. I think there's a majority to be had there. I guess I'm not worried that there are a certain number of people who believe anything. Some of our opponents think that of us. 70%, I think your figure is broadly right. It might even be a little less than 30%, and we can make democracy work on the basis of those numbers.
The point is not unanimity. We need majorities to accomplish ends. We report on a study in, yes.
One of us for each question.
Okay.
We got like
No, please.
Finish it. Wait, you can't leave him hanging on the study, and then you're
The
out.
point is the pool.
I think the majority has spoken. They want to hear anything you want to say.
Okay. The pool of people who would vote for far right parties in Europe hasn't changed. The percentage for 30 years. What makes the difference is the activity at the leadership level, the kind of appeals that are being made, the structure of the electoral system that sometimes diminishes their mobilization and activity and other times brings them to the fore. So we need other voices at the leadership level, both in communities and nationally, speaking out, and that will make a difference.
Well, you may have just answered my question, but
Ask it anyway.
I haven't heard you directly address sort of the issue of right-wing media and its actual influence. I mean, maybe that fits into your 30%, but my concern is you go home at, not my family, but many families, you go home at Thanksgiving and there's somebody who have had that on in almost as background noise for 25 years. And there's a lot of misinformation. I can talk to people and hear their pain and relate on that level. But if they've been hearing something for 25 years and believe things that are demonstrably untrue to be true, my question is, A, is it worth it to try to deal with that? And B, is do you actually think that that had an influence on this past election? The right-wing media.
Well, we have a lot on this in the book, which, by the way, makes a great holiday gift.
Not too early for Christmas and Hanukkah.
Thanksgiving?
He says it with every book.
One for Rosh Hashanah, one for Yom Kippur, another one for Sukkot. One, we have a very large problem when you lose the public square and when people cocoon in and get the information they want. Two, there is a big problem on the right because there's a deliberate attempt to lie and distort and give people false facts. And large numbers of people believe those things. Three, there's a term called motivated reasoning, where once you believe something and you get incontrovertible evidence to the contrary, you are motivated to deny that and believe something that's untrue. And dealing with that is an enormous problem in the country, and there's no clear answer. One of the things we have to do is recreate a public square and hope that if we build it, they will come. And we see some of this with public media. We need to find other ways to do it, and we need to be relentless in fact-checking, even if some people aren't going to believe it, to make sure that a larger group of people who don't pay a lot of attention don't come to believe that, for example, science is evenly divided on climate change. They need to understand reality, and that is our job as well.
Oh. Yeah. He's from the other side. Yeah, please. Do you mind? Go ahead.
I don't have a microphone. Can you hear me?
Yeah. You're loud and clear.
I grew up overseas, was born in Nebraska, raised overseas in a British school system, and it was much more authoritarian, much more regimented like the military. Can you hear me?
Let him speak, please. Go ahead.
Anyway, the Queen was in charge of the British Empire, and so as a little kid I sang God Save the Queen every morning rather than the Pledge of Allegiance. Came back here every 6 years to reaffirm my citizenship and learn how to talk like an American and spell like one and do my cursive like one. From overseas, the 60s were evolving, and LA was burning, and the riots and the drugs and the sexual revolution, and it looked like from overseas that our country was just starting to go down the toilet. Well, here we are 50 years later, and divorce rates have not gone down. Children are not more respectful of their parents. The legal system is under constant attack from every source, within and without. Terrorism is running rampant. The economy is in danger. So my question is, we're not progressing, and somehow in the midst of all that collapsing over 60 years, Trump won. I'm not sure how he did. I don't like many of the things he's done or are reported to have done. And if Mueller finds out that he's part of the swamp that needs to be drained, I hope he gets drained. But until that point, whether it takes a year or 2 years, I think we should be polite citizens and show that we're mature American world citizens and allow the rule of law to work, because that's what we're based on.
Are you done, sir?
I'm done.
Thank you very much. At first, thanks for 9 hours of prayers for the country. We need it. Could I just say really quickly, I very much agree with something in what you said, which is we do want to uphold our laws and our Constitution, but part of what that provides for is the opportunity to dissent against a government that obviously many of the people in this room, probably about half of the country now, feels is under some real threat from the president because of how he behaves on a whole series of issues. We try to make the case in our book that there is reason to be vigilant against a president whose habits sometimes resemble those of other leaders who have undercut democracy itself. And we also think that the policies Trump is pursuing, paradoxically, are likely to worsen the situation of many of the people who voted for him, particularly, for example, the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. But if you want to talk to us, I'd be happy to extend the argument with you or the conversation, but I appreciate your speaking up. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. No,
We'll get you afterward.
The lines are so long. Yeah.
I'm still concerned with how much time we spend in the general media on diversion, distraction, denial, duplicity, and not separating all of that activity in great words and pictures from what's really going on. How can we help great papers like the Washington Post and the New York Times, which I added to subscription because I want people to go on, to separate in the paper all of the 4 Ds that are distraction, because they still wanted to show it, and the do's, what's going on, so we can look at that and not get distracted out of it.
You know, one thing I will say, EJ and I did 1A on Friday. It was actually a really wonderful exchange in the Week in Review section. But we never got to, for example, Tom Price, $400,000 in taxpayer money to take chartered jets. And that's one of the key questions here, the kleptocracy, the sort of abuse of government. Some of this gets drowned out by distraction. And I think what we're hoping to do with the book is to get people focused back on these larger questions. But there's a natural tendency, both in a media looking for eyeballs and for subscriptions, to go to the controversy. And one of the things that Trump understands in his gut, whenever the news tightens, is to get out there and create a new distraction. And some of what we're dealing with today is positive, but let's face it, some of it is an attempt to distract away from the others.
Quickly, he makes it really hard because you can't really not cover what he said about Colin Kaepernick and Steph Curry, and you can't just let it go, even though if you could make a very good case that what we actually should be talking about is the health care bill and what in the world are they going to do on taxes. And we just got to figure out how to do a couple of things at the same time and not let one drown out the other, but it's really hard.
I'm struck by the absence of any discussion about corporate power and Citizens United in this process, and I was wondering if you could comment on that.
My colleagues have been fighting Citizens United, so have I, forever. So it's in the book. There's
We
a
have
lot
a
in the book.
big chunk on campaign finance and Citizens United, and the problem is it's less corporate power than it's the power of a handful of billionaires who are looking to amuse themselves and to realize their fantasies about a world they would like to create in this country. And so we have a number of suggestions for it. I mean, there's no easy answer, especially after Merrick Garland was not allowed a hearing and a vote on the court, and now it's going to be tougher and tougher. But we need a new jurisprudence that will get us beyond focusing simply on corruption to deal with the broader problems of representation, accountability in our government. So it's less that there are divisions within the corporate structure of America, as we see very much new and old, and I think we talk about that.
But we
in
also talk
some
about
respect.
reforming the corporation. In other words, I think you have a point about, I think we all agree, you have a point about corporate power, and that's why we have this charter for social responsibility, which is about reforming the corporation, because as long as the corporation is focused only on shareholder value and the bottom line, this is not George Romney capitalism. You know, if you go back and look at George Romney, this was a vision of capitalism that was about making your company successful, but also being concerned about the commonweal in some sense, what made the company, the society that made the company successful. And I don't want to be nostalgic about that, because nostalgia never works, but there was something about that approach to capitalism that was different than the one that we've had recently.
So my question
Thank you.
is not about the news or the media, but social media and Facebook, for example. And what seems to be coming out is the possibility that there are all these secret ways of influencing people who don't have any idea what's going on.
Social media more broadly is one of the drivers here. When you have tribal media, and it can be amplified by social media, and lies can spread through a number of different vehicles, and all of us regularly get emails from friends and relatives that say, "Can you believe this?" with a link to something. And just remember, if you get something that says, "Can you believe this?" don't believe it. But
just delete it.
That's right. But there's
Unless Norm is sending
That's
it.
right. Well, it might be a cat video. That's different. But there's a larger point about Facebook, a couple of large points. The first is, when Facebook agreed to give out this information, this was not Mark Zuckerberg in a patriotic gesture saying, we are going to open up. They were pushed to do it. They didn't say much when they got $150 million in revenue. But there's another element of this. What those ads did was extraordinarily sophisticated in targeting particular groups of voters, and a very large share of the country gets its information about politics from Facebook. Somebody, not a Russian, gave them that information at a sophisticated level. And what we can hope is that the Mueller investigation will dig down even deeper. And remember that this wasn't just about a presidential contest. There was targeting, including WikiLeaks that hit particular members of Congress, and then ads, including from Paul Ryan's PAC, that went after those. A lot of people here colluded, and if we don't get to the bottom of this, and if we don't, in citizen action, make sure that states are protected against problems in the future, then we will have lost our democracy.
This is as big a threat to democracy as anything I can imagine. And under semi-normal times, the President of the United States would make it the number one domestic priority to deal with a commission and with an effort to see that we protect our electoral system.
I think we'll take two more questions, the people who are at the microphones
Yes,
now.
I'm a Bernie guy. I want to go back to the primary. That Bernie v. Trump outpolled the ever-loving mess out of Hillary v. Trump. Do any of you think that Bernie could have beat Trump in the general election?
I got to say, I think I'm an agnostic on that question. I'm not certain. Here, on the first of all, Hillary did suffer some of the votes against Hillary were sexist, so that doesn't hurt Bernie. So that's on that side. And that Bernie clearly carried some of the constituencies where Trump made big inroads, the working white
Well,
working
we
class.
got ultra left socialists versus ultra right not so.
Anybody?
I mean, the divide.
Let
is
him answer,
enormous.
Right, no, but that's on the other side of the equation. In other words, I think Bernie might have had some appeal to some of the constituencies that Trump did extremely well in. I'm wondering what he would have lost on the other side, that Bernie never came in for that very much harsh attack from the Clinton campaign because they assumed they'd win the primary and did not want to alienate Bernie's voters. And we've never had a trial run of what an anti-Bernie campaign really would have looked like. So I think there's something on the side that he could have won, but I don't think we really tested the proposition very well in the primary. So as I say, I'm agnostic on the question.
I don't think we should let some Bernie people like Susan Sarandon off the hook. People who said Trump would be even better than Hillary, or there's no difference here, have some responsibility with what we're getting now. But second, you cannot look at a Bernie who went through a primary process as a kind of folk hero, even though he lost soundly. You have to look at what Bernie would have looked like after $1 billion coming from Russia, the right, and others would have done to Bernie. And, you know, we had a mini scandal with Bernie and his wife over the collapse of her college. He didn't release his own tax returns. Just imagine what they would have made out of little things there. So never look at somebody who didn't run or didn't win. That's true of Biden as well, without thinking of what it would have been like if they'd been through this meat grinder.
Last question.
Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for moderating. Thank you for hosting. I look forward to a new location, which I'm going to call Politics, Prose, and Baseball near Nationals Park.
That's a great name.
Okay. I want to incorporate baseball into it. An election is like a baseball game. You want to have your best pitcher in the 7th game. And every 4 years, we have a 7th game. It's called the presidential election. Is this the best 2 pitchers both parties could have put on the mound for their teams? Do I have to go listen to this nonsense? Oh, the game went 18 innings and it's in a draw 1-1 because this pitcher wasn't available. That pitcher wasn't available because he pitched yesterday. Joe Biden was available. John Kasich was available. And if the parties, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, pull this nonsense again, guess what? I may see it in 2028, but I look forward to seeing the first president of the United States from neither party.
Thank you. We do agree on we definitely agree on
We'll
our
place
love of
a
baseball.
side bet on that.
Just really quickly, I mean, Joe Biden obviously did run. It would have been a fascinating contest if he had run against Hillary Clinton. As Norm said, I think you could run the same analysis and see what would have happened to Joe Biden. He clearly had some assets that he could have brought to the table. But if you look at Hillary Clinton, put aside whether people, I suspect, looking at the voting of our area, this is a fairly pro-Clinton crowd, but whether you're pro or anti-Clinton, it's clearly a case that she was one of the most qualified candidates who was ever on the ballot, like or not. And that and on the Republican side, what I really think happened there is you had a tragedy of the commons where all of the other Republican candidates were kind of hoping either that they would be the last person standing against Trump and would beat him, or in the case of Ted Cruz, that he would eventually lose and then Cruz would inherit the Trump support. I think in the Republican Party, they let him go through, didn't realize the danger they faced until it was too late, and then he won the Republican nomination. So I think you can blame that on the strategists inside the Republican Party, because I agree with you. I like John Kasich better than I like Donald Trump.
But we can all agree that Max Scherzer would make a great candidate.
Okay, and I think we can all agree that you guys were fabulous. Thank you all.
And we can all agree that Deborah is fabulous.